Okay, so today we're going to be talking about picking a point of view. And when I say picking a point of view, I don't mean hero, villain, sidekick. I mean how it's going to be constructed. So first person, second person, third person. Yes, we will be talking about second person because some people actually do write in second person. Now, most writers tend to know what they like, but at the same time, you never know until you try it. I personally always wrote in first person up until about 6th grade, and then I tried third person limited, and I have never gone back. So sometimes it's good to experiment because you never know when you might find the perfect fit, and sometimes it's good to change it up per book too, because as we're going to talk about today, there are various different pros and cons to every viewpoint and how they're written. We're going to talk about not only how to craft a good introductory sentence, and by introductory sentence I mean like you're introducing the main character through that viewpoint. And kind of a good introductory sentence for each of these, and also talking about what benefits each one has and what drawbacks each one has, and who knows, maybe you'll find that one of your short stories or novels needs a different viewpoint after this, because sometimes that's what gets me stuck too, is it's not reading right because I'm not writing it in the viewpoint it's meant to be in. Alright, so first up, because I figured why not, we have first person first. Alright. Now, with first person, the pros that you mainly have are going to be immersing the reader, and that is because you are literally reading it like you're reading their point of view, but you're reading it semi as if it's yourself. It's the closest thing to reading it as if it's yourself without being second person, because obviously second person the book is addressing you, but with first person we all generally talk in first person in our heads, right? We don't talk like Jar Jar Binks generally. We're not like Cheyenne want to go home or something like that. Like, no, we're thinking, oh yeah, I want to go home, I've had a long day, or something like that. We generally think in I and we and things like that. As a result of that, it's going to be more immersive. I'm going to move the cons over a little bit. It's going to be more immersive for your reader to read in first person because of the fact that it enables them to imagine that they are that person. It enables them to physically put them in their shoes and say, okay, when they say I, they mean I, as in both of us. I am now in the mind of the character. Now, another thing that is a pro with that is you become more attached to the character as a reader. The readers tend to grow to like characters more that tend to be in first person. Not to say that you can't do that in third person, it's just a lot easier in first person because of the fact that as you're going through first person, you're feeling everything they're feeling, you're seeing everything through their eyes. It's a lot easier to be an emotional mirror. And it's important to not just have them be a mirror. This is where third person is hard, is because you generally are having mirror emotions, whereas in first person it's a lot easier to experience the emotions with the character, because they are sitting there sobbing and they're saying, I am sobbing, and well, probably not like that, it'd be more eloquent, but as they're stating how they're feeling and what they're doing, you yourself are feeling everything that they're feeling. Or if they're like a villain, for instance, and they're like, as I plunged the knife deep into their chest, you're feeling a different feeling, right, than if I said they plunged the knife deep into to the person's chest. The one gives it a little bit more of a cinematic viewpoint, and we're going to talk about the fact that there's a difference actually between cinematic and limited, but it generally gives more of a distant, whereas the first person makes it so you are so grounded in the character you almost can't help but get attached, unless the character's super annoying. Then last pro that I'm going to mention, I could mention a lot more for every single one of these, but I'm just going to stick to the things I think are most important, is internal dialogue. You can more easily do internal dialogue with first person. Third person limited is okay, but it's still a little bit tricky. You have to almost do an introduction into it, and you got to make sure that the reader's ready for it, otherwise they're going to be confused. Or if you're doing third person cinematic / omniscient, that's even trickier. It is possible, again, but because of the fact that you're doing it through a narrator, it's again a little harder. Whereas first person, it's easy to say, idiot, 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 that was all I could think to myself. You know, that flows a lot more easily in general, and the reason it flows is because we have a lot of internal thoughts, and we think about ourselves in I. So as a result, we are living vicariously through this character, and so internal thoughts feel a lot more natural in this vicarious way. All right. The next point are the cons. All right. And I'm just going to label one word for this one. Narcissist. Let me make sure I'm spelling this right. Wow. Narcissistic. Wow, that was a hard word. Alright, so with this, all I mean is that it can make them come off narcissistic if you are describing themselves in a way that they wouldn't normally do. Now, we talked about this in the tropes and cliches, but just in case you didn't watch the tropes and cliches, this is typically called the mirror scene. And the reason a lot of people do this is because they assume that you have to describe the character, and therefore, if you don't do it right off the bat, then you're going to mess everything up. True, absolutely true. There have been times where I've read first person things that halfway down the page they're like, oh yes, Lord so-and-so, and I'm like, I thought they were a girl. And you totally ruined my vision there. Let's try again. But there are ways to do this correctly, and there are ways to do this incorrectly. Now, where the narcissism comes in is when your character's describing themselves in the mirror. Or sometimes, this can also be the reverse effect. They're the opposite of narcissistic, and they're self-deprecating to the point where it's a little painful to read. A little bit of self-deprecation in a character is okay, because we all have that. But having too much of it is just really hard for people to read. So you can either have narcissist or anti-narcissist, where they're going, I have black hair, I have sparkling green eyes, I have luscious red lips. No one would describe themselves like that unless they're completely full of themselves. Whereas someone who is anti-narcissist may do something like, I wasn't nearly as handsome as Jonathan, or something like that. I was nearly as handsome as Jonathan because I didn't have, I don't know, blue eyes or something like that as your male main character. That can work. However, I wouldn't say do it for every descriptor. Don't just be like, I wasn't as handsome as Jonathan because he had blue eyes. I wasn't as handsome as David because I don't have black hair. I wasn't as... It's like, okay, you're just pointing out everything that's wrong with yourself. And sometimes we do that. But that's a little hard for the reader to digest up front. You can absolutely have them be anti-self-love. Unfortunately, that is a thing that people do later in the book, where you can describe them very plain and simple. And then later, if you want to have them be like, I really wish I was handsome as Jonathan and David, maybe then I would get a date or something like that. You know, that can lead in well, but make sure it's not the first thing readers read. It's a little hard to digest that, because we already have, as humans generally, unless you're a narcissist, generally we have a tiny bit of ourselves that's always a little self-conscious, right? So reading more of that self-conscious thought can be difficult for readers to digest. Just something to consider. All right, the next point is viewpoint switch. Speaking of viewpoint. Alright, so here's the problem with first person. If you ever want to switch viewpoints, you have to do it in third. And you don't necessarily have to. There are books that do it that aren't in third. And they'll do first, switch point of views still in first. However, it is really jarring for the reader. The reader they get comfortable. They get really comfortable in that first person skin. So if you purposely like rip them out of that first person skin and plant them in another body in first person still, that is really jarring to read. Possible to do, but jarring to read. And so ultimately I would say if you're going to do a viewpoint switch with first person, make sure it's in third. So make sure it's all in first except for that viewpoint switch, which you do in third. With that being said, it is possible, just make sure that you introduce it right. For example, if you're going to switch, I would not recommend switching in the middle of a chapter if you're going to do first person viewpoint switch. I would say like, this is Kalia's chapter, this is Donatello's chapter, and you purposely make it so that when you switch first person, each chapter has its own first person instead of switching mid-paragraph. That's where it gets a little jarring for the reader generally. So switching point of view is a little harder in first person, which is part of the reason why if you're doing first person, you got to make sure you love your character. Because if you don't love your character, you're stuck with them.
It's kind of convenient enough because I just read a book and it would switch between perspectives of the different characters.
Yeah, which you can absolutely do, but it's a little bit easier when it's not in first person, right? It's a little harder when it's in first person. All right, the next point is actually what I was just talking about. You can easily get annoyed with your main character and decide, I don't want to write this book anymore. They're kind of obnoxious. But then, as I said, you could just say, I'll fix it by just switching viewpoint. But your reader has already adjusted to viewpoint A. Therefore, if you switch to viewpoint B,
you can't just be like,
I'm just
start a
ditching
new
this
chapter,
now.
and this chapter is dedicated to this one character, and in the middle of it, you change perspective.
In the middle of it, just nope, I'm done. Yeah, you've got to make sure that you don't get annoyed with the character. Pick a character that you love and would love to stay with no matter what. Make sure that you're as dedicated to this character as you would be to your very best friend in the whole universe. No matter what they do, you may get in fights, you may get frustrated, they may be obnoxious sometimes, but you will stick with them.
That is the exact definition of my friend.
You will stick with them. That is important to remember with first person. So I put it in the cons category, but ultimately, as long as you have a good character, it's a pro. But it's a con because sometimes it can be detrimental to stick with one character if you don't like them very much. All right. Now I'm going to give an example of a first-person introduction. I'm going to kind of be using the same names and places and generalized description, so it's easier to tell the differences. Now, as I mentioned before, it's hard not to do the, and I brushed my black hair, and I looked at my green eyes in the mirror description, or it's hard not to do the, I wasn't nearly as pretty as Bethany kind of thing. And it's just a little goofy, but there is a way that you can do it in first person without making it too jarring. And this is, once again, show versus tell. Telling generally is rough no matter what you do. So I'm just gonna, I ran my hands through my curly black hair. Oh boy, where am I? Blue eyes. Flashing with fire. All right. And I added more to that sentence. I also added, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that Nora had completely ignored me on purpose, just to give a sense of emotion as well. But if you're just doing a basic description, this is a great way to do it. You have an action, so that way it doesn't feel quite so goofy. And I know that this might be where a trope or cliche person might say, but, oh, I did say I brushed my black hair. I'm sorry, that's not very interesting. You gotta have an action that's interesting. Running your hands through your hair angrily and your eyes flashing with ire. Now that is gonna capture someone's imagination, whereas just your whimsical, I brushed my hair, I put on some lip gloss or whatever, that's not exactly catching my interest. I'm like, Okay, that's something either I, or if you're not a girl, my sister does every day. Like, okay, don't care. You got to give an action or a feeling or emotion tied to the descriptors. That way, that emotion, that action and emotion tied to those descriptors help give it more depth and make sure that your action and emotions are interesting. They're not just bland everyday things. Generally, when you're introducing a character, with any good first sentence, and we'll talk about this in another lesson about first sentences, but with any good first sentence, you want to make sure that you are capturing your audience's attention. And with capturing your audience's attention, generally, you don't want to start with the mundane. Not unless it's unusual. Like, if you want to say, I brushed my black hair as my hairbrush screamed. Now that would make me interested. Confused, but also interested. I might actually read that scene. Because of the fact that it has something unusual. You got to make sure your first sentence has either some sort of dramatic emotion that helps us get connected to the character, or it's got to have some form of action. And it can even be a small action. It just has to have something that is not ordinary. Because if it's too ordinary, it's going to make the readers kind of go, should I care? Do I care? You know, it's kind of like with Greatest Showman, right? Even if you skip the cool little introduction song that they do and go straight to when he's a little boy, he's staring at this suit coat in a window pretending like he's wearing it, right? And then he goes to this rich girl's house and starts, kind of flirting with her. It's interesting, that's unusual. Generally, that's like a taboo, right? You don't flirt with the rich girl because you ain't gonna get the rich girl. You're a poor boy, It's just not gonna happen. Especially back in those times, for sure. Nowadays, it's like, whatever. But back then, it was a big no. And so it gave some sort of emotional contrast that made us connected. We were like, oh, is he actually gonna get with the girl? Or are we actually gonna see them together in the future? Do they matter? It left us with more questions than answers, which is important too. All right, sorry about my side tangent. Now we're gonna talk about third limited. Pros and cons. All right. So, with third limited, we're going to talk about the pros first again. You can switch between characters. Yay! Now, I will say, be careful when you switch between characters in third person limited, because if it's limited, you got to make sure you introduce it first. As a result, you may put at the beginning of the chapter, this is Idelia's chapter or whatever. Or you can, if you're switching mid-paragraph and you're kind of switching off between two characters and you're like, here's Idelia and, I don't know, Bob. And you want to switch to Bob's point of view, generally what you're going to want to do, it's super easy, hence why I'm putting it in the pro category, but you got to make sure you do this. You just got to do 3 little asterisk stars in the meantime. Generally, once you publish, they'll switch that to something fancy, like if you're doing a romance novel, it might be roses, or if you're doing an action novel, it might be knives or something. But in the meantime, asterisks are the way you're going to differentiate if you're changing something drastically. If you're changing time, if you're changing viewpoint, asterisks are the way to go. But it is super easy to switch with third limited, because all you have to do is go BAM! Asterisks! And poof! Now everyone knows something drastic is happening. So when you switch from, say, Idelia was wondering who the murderer was, and then all of a sudden you go, Bob was wandering down the street. They won't be like, why are we talking about Bob now? They'll be like, oh, there was an asterisk, therefore Bob. You know that, kind of know what's coming. All right. The next thing is, you can show things the characters might not notice. Because even though it is third limited, so it is their point of view, you can still showcase things that they might not notice. For instance, if they have been in this school their entire life, they may not say, and the lockers were green and things like that, but because it's third limited, you can say, as they fidgeted with the lock on their emerald green locker, you can say that because even though they wouldn't be thinking about that normally, so you wouldn't say that in first person necessarily as easily, you can say it in third limited because of the fact that there is an overarching kind of narrator. Yes, it's limited, so it's not like omniscient in that regard, but there is a semi-narrator. Now, omniscient's entirely different, but third limited, there's a semi-narrator that is kind of co-authoring with the main character, right? So it's a lot easier to demonstrate details that they may not notice. All right. Next thing is easy to digest. Why? Because this is kind of how we already see movies, right? I mean, third person, omniscient / cinematic, it's even more so, but it's a little different when you're reading. So with third person limited, it feels kind of more like you're watching a movie, and as a result, it's easier for readers to digest. That's why a lot of novels are third person limited. Not a lot of third person omniscient, and not a lot of first person. Why? Because first person, even though it gets you more attached to the character and more entrenched in their emotions, you find yourself as a reader, or at least most people do, having to wade into it a little bit. You have to be like, okay, I am with this person now. Whenever they say I, it is them, because you're used to saying I in your head is you, so you kind of have to wade into it, almost like putting on a costume. So it's almost like putting on a costume with first person, because of the fact that you're having to wade into this point of view and kind of get used to the fact that, oh, when I say I in my head now as I'm reading, I don't mean I mean them. But also, I'm reading it. It's definitely a great point of view, but it takes a little getting used to. It's kind of, like I said, putting on a costume, you know. You got to put on the pants, you got to put on the shirt. If there's a mask, you got to put on the mask. It's a lot of work, right? Whereas with third person limited, it's super easy to just jump right in, just dive head first, because you may not know anything that's happening, but there is a semi-narrator to guide you along. The narrator's working with that main character in order to tell the story. So with third limited, you have two narrators basically, which makes it so much easier to kind of just dive right in versus the one where you're like, I have to adjust to what's happening. And with third omniscient, you have to adjust to the narrator. And is this a reliable narrator? Are they not a reliable narrator? There's all kinds of things that can happen with third omniscient, whereas third limited is generally very straightforward, very to the point. Meanwhile, cons. You have to keep the same character point of view unless you indicate the change. So, it's both a pro and a con. So, with this, I generally just mean it's important to make sure that if you're going to do viewpoint switches, you do the asterisk thing. So people are aware there is going to be a change. Or you introduce it at the beginning of each chapter, just stick with it the whole chapter. But not everyone can do that, and I definitely get that. I've switched in the middle of chapters before, but if you do that, asterisks. Asterisks are necessary. So, and I mean, hey, once you get it published, then they'll change it to something fancy, like I was saying earlier. You could do roses if it's a romance or something. Swords, exactly. I said daggers earlier.
Swords.
There you go. So like you could do cool things, but like for now, just do asterisks because it's easy. But the point is, with the viewpoint, it's kind of like first person in the regard that you have to keep the same viewpoint the whole time. You can't just switch for a random paragraph and then switch back. And I gotta admit, this is really hard. I think a lot of people assume that third person limited is more forgiving, but it's actually not. If you want to have more forgiving narration thing, where you can just switch around wherever you want, go to omniscient, which we're going to talk about in a second. But you also got to keep in mind, if you're going to be switching narrators, you introduce that early. If you don't introduce that early, it can sometimes jar the reader a little bit. If you have like 7 chapters of the same character and then all of a sudden you're like, I want to do chapter 8 in a different point of view. You can do that. Just know that your readers might be kind of like on a roller coaster ride where they're like, I totally understand what's happening. Then they fall off. And it's like, well, maybe they'll adjust and they'll be like, I actually like that roller coaster. That new point of view was awesome. But like at first they're just like, I'm falling down a hill. What is happening? So it's important to keep in mind that if you're going to do viewpoint switches, you introduce it early in the story rather than later. Unless you're purposely trying to be jarring and weird. In which case, go for that. So, depends on what you're trying to do, I suppose. Alright. Takes a little bit more effort to keep the reader immersed. Whereas with first person, it's really easy to immerse the reader, right? Because we already naturally think in I, we, etc. So as a result, if you're thinking in I, we, etc., and then you're like, oh, I'm reading about this person in I, we, etc., kind of easy to be like, oh, I smell cinnamon buns. Yes, I do smell cinnamon buns. Kind of leans you into it a little bit more. However, with third person limited, if you forget to describe something as the semi-narrator helping the main character, they're not going to know. And if you're like halfway through, yes, I finally went and got those cinnamon buns that I was talking about earlier, you're like, never mentioned there were cinnamon buns. This is kind of an important detail if it matters. The cinnamon buns are poison. What? There were cinnamon buns? These are important. It's kind of like white room syndrome. This happens a lot in third limited because you're so immersed in the fact that, oh no, I'm being stabbed, that you don't think about, where am I being stabbed? What is happening?
I'm being stabbed.
Context.
It's like, I'm being stabbed. Oh, also, the cinnamon rolls are poison. There were cinnamon rolls?
There were cinnamon rolls? We're in a bakery? What? I was imagining a battlefield.
Okay. So, we go poop. We're in a bakery. Poop. There are cinnamon buns. I eat them. They're poisoned. I get stabbed.
Just too many things. Okay.
Too many pooping. I don't like the pooping.
Exactly. You don't want your character to teleport unless they're supposed to be teleporting. In which case, introduce that as well.
And then describe the color of the portal. If
exactly. Or if they feel like wind or rain or something fancy.
Yeah.
Or
if there's if they feel nauseous.
Exactly.
Explain that. World building portal's good.
Exactly. World building is fantastic. Don't skip the world building. And this, I think, is where people struggle the most. And this is why a lot of people are like, a lot of people your guys' age struggle with the whole idea that like, I wrote this whole novel and it is 25,000 words. And it's like, great if you're doing junior fiction. If you're doing a YA novel, it has to be at least 50,000, unless it's a graphic novel, in which case half of it's pictures anyway. So, graphic novels are another story. But if you're not doing a graphic novel, generally 50,000 words is the minimum. Why? Because of world building. It's not because we're trying to do arbitrary rules just to make your life harder. I promise that is not the point.
That's what English is for.
Exactly. That's what academic literature is for, where they have to be like, there's 30 pages of random research where I'm going to talk about this random stuff. Sorry, can you tell I didn't like academic literature very much? Yeah, I'm glad I'm done with those classes. The professors were great, but I did not like having to write 30-page papers for no reason.
Makes sense.
But with the 50,000 words, the reason it's a thing is because you want to emotionally develop the characters, you want to develop the world, you want to make sure that it's all together, and takes a lot more effort in third limited, especially. In first person, you might be able to get away with like, let's say, 45,000 words or 35,000 words, but in third, you definitely need more world building. All right, the last point on this one is going to be that with third person limited, info dumping is a problem. Yep.
Just so after boot camp on Saturday, there were 5 different classes that mentioned no info dumping, and I'm like, yes, got it, good, thank you.
I mean, but it's important because I'll be honest, there are lots of people who don't even know what info dumping is at your guys' age. So it's important that you guys know that. And there's nothing wrong with not knowing that, but at the same time, the sooner you learn that, the easier life is going to be. Especially trying to get published, because with info dumping, a lot of times editors, the second they see info dumping, will say, you're too much work, I'm not going to publish you. Which is just so sad, because the rest of the book might be absolutely fabulous.
And I'm Brandon Sanderson level, which if you're at that level, I envy you.
Exactly. You might be the next Brandon Sanderson, you're just struggling a little bit to figure out how to say it. You never know. But unfortunately, when it comes to being traditionally published, they have certain views, and info dumping is a big no. Now, what is info dumping? Does anyone
Not good.
Not good. Not good. We've established this. Info dumping, bad. Yes.
So pretty much, info dumping is when you're like putting in a bunch of information that like isn't crucial to the plot line, like all at once.
Yep. So it's either not crucial to the plot line, or if it is crucial to the plot line, you are telling rather than showing. And so as a result, it feels more like a dumping instead of like, oh, I'm being immersed in this world. It feels like, and by the way, did you know that these spiders are poisonous? And it's like, but okay, why do I care? And it's like, maybe that's crucial to the plot. And it's like, twist, that pet spider that was supposed to be harmless, it was that spider that I mentioned at the beginning. And it's like, well, that's cool. If you hadn't just info dumped so much, I skipped it. So that's another problem with info dumping, is if you info dump too much, then generally people want to skim, which is bad, because generally the info dumping, the whole point is you're like, I want to help immerse you in your world, so let me tell you all the things. That's good. But telling instead of showing and having too many unnecessary details bog down the necessary ones is when it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
Show it, keep it like keep the important stuff, nix everything else.
Yep.
And do it well.
Yes. So show instead of tell. I agree. Those are 3 great points. Show instead of tell. Do it well. And then on top of that, if it's not important right now, you can nix it. Especially because if it really matters to your world, or even if it doesn't really matter, it's not a necessary detail, you can add that as a fun fact later in your book. Like, for example, with the little frog cards in Harry Potter where they have famous witches and wizards on the back. That was a great way of them being like, hey, by the way, fun fact, this witch or wizard, like, invented this thing, by the way. But, like, it wasn't necessary to the plot, usually, you know? And so as a result of that, it's important to keep world building interspersed throughout your novel, and then keep the necessary stuff in the scene. You don't want to keep all the world building in one giant place. That is a recipe for drowning readers. If you want to drown your readers violently, then info dump. But otherwise, you're fine.
Like, look, a world that isn't ours. Yay! I was just like, no.
Yep. It's like, yeah, I gotta say, the one thing I love about info dumping is the fact that you get a lot packed into one bit. True. But there's a better way to do that. Not to say that info dumping is always bad, because sometimes it's necessary, but you gotta do it tactfully if you're gonna do it. Like you said, you gotta make sure you do it well. If you gotta have an info dump, you gotta make sure you introduce it with dialogue, or you introduce it with lots and lots of, you keep all the important stuff, so if you need to info dump and you're like, oh yes, we found this random page of a historical textbook and all of it matters, then okay, great, but only keep the stuff that actually matters.
Yeah, so with the historical text thing, just
yeah.
before Brandon sent the poem was born.
Exactly. Then you can chunk it out into little bits at the beginning of each chapter. That way and that's part of why he did that. If he had that entire thing as a prologue, that would have been so hard to read. But because it was little bits at the beginning of each chapter, you were kind of like, okay, it was more like a little refreshing. It was kind of like, chocolate cake. Generally people like chocolate cake, but do you want to eat a whole chocolate cake in one sitting? Generally not.
No.
No. Bad idea. However, if you have one slice of chocolate cake per day, that's great. Maybe not for your health, but it tastes great.
I mean, if you're balanced, it's just they have protein and meat, breakfast and dinner, and then cake. I mean, sure. I always do pieces of this big, like that one time.
Huge pieces. Yeah, no. So, in general,
I call it a piece of cake.
Yeah, if you're gonna do info dumping, make sure that you treat it like chocolate cake or a dessert, where you have a little bit each day. You don't just eat all of it in one sitting.
Don't have to hold a bucket of ice cream at once.
Exactly. Generally bad. All right.
You've never done that.
I actually have.
No, you haven't.
Ice cream freezer, remember?
Yeah, but that's not one of the buckets. And so Michael, A, that wasn't the bucket.
So
B, it was half gone.
Next, we're going to talk about the example of third limited. So
No, it wasn't.
we're going to talk about introducing characters for each one because of the fact that I think introducing characters is one of the hardest parts, and that and that's the reason why most people either avoid it altogether and then halfway through say they have red hair and you're like, wait, what? Or if they don't avoid it, they spend so much time on it that you're like, I know what their face looks like down to the very last scar that they had on their cheek from when they were 2. You don't need that much detail.
Yeah, please don't give me that much detail. I will be bored.
Exactly. There's a balance.
Okay.
There's a showing, not telling kind of thing to it.
The
Yes.
first example, of course, Steelheart. Yeah, because
Oh
I
my
haven't read
God.
it, so I wouldn't know.
You
but-
need to get over Steelheart. So
All
her
right.
hair is brown. So what?
I didn't know. I thought she was a redhead.
Yeah, that's like the only brand of sandwich that would have read so far.
Yeah. Brown Sound is like a wizard when it comes to books. He's just magic. Phew, like,
Huh?
I swear, he could read like a novel this big in a week. And I'm like, how? To be fair, he doesn't have school. But
All right. So, with this, it helps once again, showing, not telling, but I'm giving a different example each time because it sounds slightly different for each point of view. First, you introduce either I, Lila, etc. Then you have ran. This helps give an action that is interesting to the character. If you say brush their hair, that's not interesting.
Everyone brushes their hair.
Exactly. Everyone generally, I mean, unless you're trying to get dreadlocks on purpose and just never brush your hair and it's
I
gross, then in general you
I
want to
have
brush your
seen
hair.
you
We've
brush
all
your
brushed our
hair.
hair.
One.
Point is that we've at least done it once in our lives.
How you get
Meanwhile, so if you're running your hands through your hair, then it helps give more of an action, especially because generally when you run your hands through your hair, either there are 3 reasons why you might do it, which leads the reader to believe certain things, right? You're either stressed, or you have hair in your face, or it's windy outside. Generally, those are the 3 occasions I can think of where you might run your fingers through your hair. Or, I guess, if you're trying to do the emo, sassy lover look, like, or something like that. Like, if you're doing that thing, then sure. But, and there's nothing wrong with that. Lots of people use that trope, including Marissa Meyer, where Kai is constantly like, with cinders around, and I'm like, okay, Kai, chill.
chill. You're pretty. I get it.
We understand you're a pretty boy. Now
I'm
move on.
already in love with 2 fictional characters. Shut up.
We don't need more. Yeah. So with that, it's totally fine to do things like that if you're going to do the angsty hair flip thing. But running your hands through your hair generally has a connotation of frustration or hair in your face, something that's annoying, right? It gives automatically a kind of ugh vibe generally, unless your purpose of being flirtatious, I guess. And then as a result, you can introduce her hair is black and curly more seamlessly. Instead of stating it as a fact, it becomes more flow. Becomes more easy to flow into the novel.
Flows more easily.
Yes, exactly. There we go. So, next point, you could also add emotions to it. Fury, sparkling. So sparkling is the action, but fury is the emotion that makes it interesting. If you just said sparkling blue eyes, you might think like innocent and flirtatious. But the second you add fury onto it, you're like, hey, somebody might die. And then you say blue eyes. You don't just say eyes because of the fact that then that's an easy way to introduce what color the eyes are.
There's like fury sparkling in her eyes. Wait, the whole point of this was to say the color of her eyes.
Yep. Exactly. It's always sad to me when I'm like, you had the perfect opportunity and you missed it. Alright, now because this is also third, I'm just gonna say omniscient. So, third omniscient, pros and cons. Alright, the pros and cons to third omniscient. Now, third omniscient is kind of dying out a little bit. The only people I know that have ever officially done third omniscient, I believe, are Lord of the Rings and Orson Scott Card for sure does it in some of his. So I'm not sure if anyone else, and I think Ursula K. Le Guin as well. I think she also does. Yeah, I think she for sure does. So in general, when it comes to literature, third limited is like, if you were to make a pie chart of perspectives, you'd probably have like third omniscient, first person, and then limited. That's generally how it would kind of go. Third omniscient isn't necessarily what a lot of people use. Third limited is by far at least 50% of literature. Third omniscient is probably more like less than 25%. I would probably say 15%, and then the rest goes to first person. So first person and third limited are generally preferred, but that doesn't mean you can't do this. Obviously, Lord of the Rings, very famous. Orson Scott Card's books, very famous. Ursula K. Le Guin, not as famous as she once was, but definitely very famous in her time. So as a result, these are all names that you're aware of. It can be used to great effect. However, doesn't mean that it's easy. So the pros is easy to switch. And when I say switch, I don't mean switch from point of view, because it's omniscient. So when I say easy to switch, it's easy to switch which character you're talking about. It's easy to switch which character you're following. It's easy to talk about a different place. It's easy to talk about a different time. You can pretty much jump borderline wherever you want, so long as it makes sense. As a result of that, here comes the next pro. Multiple viewpoints is so easy. Remember how it's like you have to have all these clarifiers in third person limited, and in first person it's almost a big no-no unless you do it in third person. And if you do it in first person, generally switch per chapter, don't switch in the middle of the page, it's confusing. In general, first person and third person limited have a lot of like, maybe if you don't do this, or unless this. There's a lot of howevers, buts, unlesses, etc. Whereas with third omniscient, it pretty much is like, hiya, free liberty. So if you're like, I want to have complete freedom, go with this one. It gives you absolute and complete freedom. You can do as many viewpoints as you want. You can switch almost any time you want. Honestly, as long as it makes coherent sense, and you sometimes add a couple asterisks if you're doing a drastic shift. But otherwise, you are doing it through a narrator, right? Either you or you are creating a narrator that is either reliable or unreliable. And as a result of that, you can do whatever you want with that narrator. If that narrator is, for instance, oh man, I think I wouldn't necessarily consider it omniscient, but it's borderline third omniscient, I think. No, I would say it's third omniscient. So with, or at least the TV show is, the TV show Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Fantastic. I will say it is more like TV 14, so I will say some of you can't watch it yet, others if you can. But I would say it's generally a really good show for third omniscient. Why? Because you have this narrator that is only semi-reliable. Technically, she's fully reliable according to her, right? Because she is Agnes Nutter. And the whole point is that there's this prophecy book called The Reliable, something like that, Accurate and Reliable Prophecies of Agnes Nutter. And she is the narrator. It's not the witch, it's not the devil, it's not the angels, it's her. As a result of that, you get this third omniscient viewpoint where she can sometimes skip to a random demon in hell and then pop back up and be like, we're on Earth now and talking about this angel dude. And you can switch around completely wherever you want because of the fact that she is the narrator, and as a result, she's like, I see this as valuable information, therefore you are going to hear this information. So it makes third omniscient a lot easier to pop around.
Start your homework.
All right. All right. Okay. Next point. It is easier to world build because of the fact that with a narrator, your narrator can talk about whatever they want, right? Whereas with first person, it's like, oh, well, they're super into weapons. So even though there's this really cool boutique over here that actually matters, your character's like, ooh, weapons, ignore the important thing. And that happens with third limited and with first person. Whereas with omniscient, you can be like, by the way, they're walking over to this weapons store, but you might want to pay attention to that boutique over there because there's about to be an assassination there. You know, like, you could do that with your narrator. You can do that with your narrator and make it so that it's almost compelling and interesting in a different way, because you're like, ew, the narrator just told me a spoiler alert. You know, like, it feels different to have a narrator doing it, but it does make it easier to world build, easier to have multiple point of views, and easier to switch between them. All right. Now time to talk about the cons and the reason why only about 15% of authors ever use this one. All right, it's easy to slip into limited without even realizing it. Why? Because with the narrator, you gotta make sure you stick with that narrator. Because if you ever sway away from the narrator and slip into this third limited, that's gonna cause problems. Your book won't read as smooth. Because we wanna see the narrator from beginning to the very end. We don't want to suddenly be like, we were introduced with this sassy narrator that I really liked, and all of a sudden she disappeared in episode 4. You know, it's like, but I liked her. You know, where'd she go? No. And so you gotta make sure that you're being careful to avoid third person limited, because it's so easy to slip into with this. It's also more work for details. As I said, it is so easy to world build and so easy to have multiple point of views, so easy to switch, all benefits. But here comes the drawback. It's so much work to keep track of all that. As a result, most people who do third omniscient are like Ursula K. Le Guin, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Orson Scott Card, in the regard that they make a giant world building book before they basically even get started. That's part of the reason only about 15% of authors do it. Because you basically have to be like, okay, I have 17 different characters I'm going to jump between as this narrator. And you have to be like, okay, so-and-so, their whole backstory. And then you have to be like, oh, right, and I mentioned that this boutique was important, so I should probably actually have it be important. You basically have to pre-write a ton of info dumping in a separate journal to make sure that when you write it, you don't accidentally forget something that you foreshadowed or did or used and change it.
Yeah. You know, like you foreshadow like like Jeremy Serious Mark. And then like at the end of the book he doesn't even show up.
Exactly, he doesn't even matter. He doesn't show up. Yeah, that would be problematic, which is part of the reason why people avoid third omniscient, because it's so much work to keep track of all the stuff.
And I was like 10 and writing my like first chapter, which I like literally like completely redid.
No worries, we all have all done that.
When I like started off, I like we're going to the Stormlit Tavern, and then I had them go to like a completely different tavern. I was like, hey,
Like,
why?
Wait, what happened here?
Because like, they were going to go to the tavern for a map, and they were like, oh, train station's closed. Guess we're going to a tavern. I'm like, guys.
You're like, wait, hold on. Yeah. It's important to remember all these things. And yes, these things can happen with third limited and with first person and with even the second person one that hopefully we'll have time to talk about. Need to rush through this last bit.
Second person's weird.
Yeah, it's super weird. But the whole point is that it's hard. That's part of the reason a lot of people avoid it. Not saying that you should avoid it. I say if you feel you want to go for it, do it. Especially because sassy narrators, I love a good sassy narrator. Exactly. So as a result, it's totally fine to do things like that, right? Totally fine to do sassy narrators, totally fine to do things omnisciently, but it's difficult to achieve. All right. And then, as I keep mentioning, I'll just mention a tiny bit because I've basically been saying it. Your narrator basically becomes their own character, so you got to make sure that if they are not a character in the novel, because with Alcatraz it's borderline third limited because of the fact that it's future Alcatraz talking to you about past Alcatraz, and so they are technically a different character, but only in the sense of time, right? And whereas if you're doing a totally separate narrator, like for example Agnes Nutter, she only appears in one episode for maybe 10 minutes. The whole rest of the time, she is not in there. Her prophecies are, but nothing else is. As a result of that, her narrator becomes her own character. And you have to keep track of that as well. It's yet another thing to keep track of.
Future Alcatraz is like my favorite person ever.
Yep, so like, it honestly can be great. Like, I definitely do not discourage you from doing omniscient viewpoint. Just know that if you're doing it, you gotta commit to it, because it is gonna take a big commitment. You know, it's like those people who are like, oh, I've been dating for a little bit, maybe we become boyfriend and girlfriend. That's like third limited level, first person level of, commitment. When you're doing third omniscient, think of it as like, basically you're marrying yourself to this plot. You gotta make sure you are committed to this, you know what you're getting into.
Writer and plot line.
Exactly, writer and plot line, and you are together till the end. Like, you gotta make sure you're committed.
I will hunt you down.
Exactly, you gotta be committed to that. Like, it's important. Alright, I'm just gonna read this one, because even though I've been writing them, we're starting to run out of time. For third omniscient, you can do fun things with the narrators. For example, Lila ran her fingers through her black curly hair, blue eyes sparkling with fury. I knew that as she glanced down at Nora sheepishly, wondering as if she was wondering what she was thinking. Meanwhile, the frustration burned on Lila's face, showing that she was certain Nora had not ignored her. Wonder where this is going. It kind of gives you this kind of you first-person-ish thing, but they're telling the story to you. It almost gives the vibe of like a bard telling you this yarn. It's fancy, It's kind of like the, well, I wonder where this is going, kind of sassy, like, oh my.
Fancy in a way that's very annoying.
It can be annoying, which is part of the reason why with third omniscient, you got to make sure that you like the voice that you've came up with for third omniscient. Some people like third omniscient, some people don't, and that's okay too. There's just part of the reason why I highly recommend you create your own character for your narrator, because just kind of throwing in random comments like that isn't going to go as well as if you actually have a character as a narrator, even if they're not in your story. Like you said, Future Alcatraz, or Agnes Nutter in Good Omens and things like that. It introduces another point of view telling the story to you. Alright, next is second person. Yep.
It's funky.
It's funky. It's freaking funky. But people like it, so.
I have a fun idea for second person.
Is usually used for like you choose your own adventure.
Yes, absolutely, and that's actually what I'm going to talk about. The only reason I'm talking about it pretty much is choose your own adventure. And also,
the only place it shows up.
Yeah, that and insert self fan fictions. That is the other time it shows up.
I had
Those don't usually get published though.
I had a fun idea for second person, where it's like the person the author is talking to had amnesia. I'm like, dude, you really don't remember this. I'm like, fine, oh well. Well, as you were like battling this one orc, right? And it's fun.
I like that because it almost blends omniscient with second.
Yeah.
That's cool. I love that actually. You should do that. All right.
No one steal my idea. That is copyrighted. I will hunt you down.
Alright, I'm gonna go steal this idea.
No.
I know where you live.
I was gonna say you're her brother. A bad idea. All right, moving right along.
Beat you
So-
up daily.
The main pro of this, and the only pro I'm going to mention, the reader feels super included. Right?
Yeah, no.
In all other viewpoints, it's kind of like, I have to adjust to so-and-so's viewpoint. I have to adjust to this narrator. I have to adjust to this. It's all about adjusting. Whereas this one, it's straight up, you are you. Now move on. Like, no need to describe you. You know what you look like. And besides, even if they tried to do that, that'd be bizarre unless you did it for, like, specifically one person. But that wouldn't get published. It'd be too hard.
You're blonde hair. She's like a redhead, right? With your blonde hair. I have blonde hair.
It's like, this is new.
It's dirty.
See, this is the moment when someone's like, guess what? Okay, we now have the technology to be like, and it dyes your hair immediately. What? I didn't want purple hair. Yeah, no. Unless that day comes, you should be safe.
Like,
So,
Just like, I got red hair and I'm sick. I've always wanted it.
all right.
Red hair
Meanwhile,
is sick. It's the coolest.
it's very cool. All right. Meanwhile, cons. You usually have to do a choose your own adventure. As I said, there's one other type, but generally that doesn't get published, so your options are pretty limited. I will say Gwen is definitely a new spin on it.
Again, don't steal it.
Don't steal it. But yeah, choose your own adventure is generally the only thing you can do with this. Why? Because of the fact that you don't want to force the reader down a path that they don't want to go down. This is another con, but I won't bother writing it down, is you can't really force the readers to follow a certain plot if they don't want to. And if you do, they'll probably stop reading. For example, if you're like, and by the way, you fall in love with this person, and you're like, they're literally not my type, they are butt ugly. You're like, no, I don't want to fall in love with that person. Like, please don't. Like, they have a wart on their nose the size of Texas. Like, I don't want that. What? Like, I don't want that. No thanks. Please no.
Their nose looks like a sword.
But of course, yes, their nose is a sword. They're a swordfish now. Yeah, no, you don't.
Nodding and they casually shredding someone's face.
Yeah, no, you don't want to do that to your poor reader when you're like, by the way, you have to fall in love with this toxic person, and you're like, no, I'd rather be in love with the fluff ball, thanks.
Like, no, I don't have to fall in love with him.
Yeah, just like, I would burn this book if I have to.
Yep.
I will fight this.
All right, but yeah, so you get the idea. The fact that generally you don't want to force the reader to do things. And yes, I mentioned a lot of romance because that is typically a lot of choose your own adventures nowadays. However, you can also do a lot of things like mysteries. You can do things like, there's been a lot of ones recently where it's called like, would you survive blank? And they'll have like, would you survive the Titanic? And then it's choose your own adventure where like you get to try and pick which way you would survive kind of a thing. Or do you survive? Do you drown?
Would you survive 2020? No.
No.
No one survived that.
But anyway, so So on that note, with Choose Your Own Adventures, it makes it a lot more easy for the reader to feel included, but it also makes it a little hard on you because you have to come up with multiple different endings and multiple different directions that it can all go. You have to keep track of them all.
Wait, what different direction?
Not one direction? So like you're writing a choose your own adventure and you think that's difficult. Wait till you code that.
Yeah, that's fair. Which is why
I coded that.
Oh, it's rough.
You made a choose your own adventure in code?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I'm trying to do that.
I'll show
It's
you
hard.
how in a little bit.
All right.
Okay.
So
I mean, I know the basic makeup.
My favorite thing of doing in the choose your own adventure is trying to die as fast as I can.
trying to die as fast as possible. See, there you go. You enjoy that. Someone else might not enjoy that. That's why Choose Your Own Adventure is so beautiful. It's because one person might be like, haha, see how fast I can die. And another person's like, I want to live. You know, they have different goals.
Screw that guy who wants
Or
to
if it's a romantic Choose Your Own Adventure, you're like, I want the handsome cowboy with the gentle heart, and someone else can be like, I want the angsty boy in the corner. You know, you can do that. And as a result, the reader feels more included. It feels like they have a lot more options. Next point, though, and the last point, is that it is hard to give a little bit of world building with second person, because with world building second person, you generally struggle with changing setting a lot. You generally also struggle with the fact that you want to leave options open, so you don't want to just force them to go up the stairs. You want to give them an option to not go up the stairs, kind of a thing.
You want to go
So
up
you
the
only
stairs,
have
down the stairs to the basement. Do you want to go into the kitchen,
Exactly.
grab a snack? Do you want to go to the living room, watch some TV? Do you want to go to the library,
Right.
house, like read a book?
You have so many different options that it gets hard to keep track of, and it's hard to world build because you're like, oh, I want them to go to the library, but wait, I have to write the other 3 endings first, or things like that. It makes it a little, like I said, just difficult to keep track of. Now, with second person intro, I gotta say, this one is interesting because you have to do a lot of showing and not a lot of telling, or at least if you're doing it right. Showing's better. So with this, I'm going to give a basic example, same as all the rest. I'm basically going to treat it like you are Lila now, despite the fact that we've done this for like 7 times and they're clearly a female and half of you are male. But
I'm the only female student in this group.
Yep.
That's
Which is
cool.
sad because I know we have other females. But anyway,
Yeah, no.
Okay, dude, Sarah never comes in.
I know, it's so sad. But anyway, so you run your hands through your hair and glare at Nora. She stares at her lap with shame. You ignored me. Do you even care at all? You scowl at her. So that gives you kind of an idea of like immersing you in that emotion, immersing you in that moment, and you're giving detail without giving too much detail. It kind of helps keep the quick pace. Now I will say this is another benefit of Choose Your Own Story. You can write a shorter Choose Your Own Story because of the fact that you don't need 50,000 words for Choose Your Own Story because they are choosing 90% of it and most of their imagination is doing the work.
Yeah, just like, do you want to go? Just like, do you want to go to the bathroom and drown? Or do you want
Exactly.
to go to the kitchen and die?
Yep.
Yeah. And get stabbed.
You have very few options as a result of having, or if you have a lot of options, even more so, you can't give as much detail if you have like 7 different options, you know, because you have to get through.
Options like every time I hit you.
But yeah, so it's a lot of work, but it can be really well worth it. And then, as I mentioned before, technically there are also what's called self-inserts, but that's generally for fan fiction. I've never seen a self-insert actually published. Not to say that you can't do it though. By all means, if you want to try it, go for it. Just know that with self-inserts, it is harder to publish because it is a very unique genre that is typically reserved for fan fiction. And with self-inserts, it's more like self-insert into a particular plot. So it'd be like the whole plot of Avengers, but you are an extra Avenger with cool powers. And so you're basically following a previously done plot, but you're adding the character in there so it feels more immersive to them because they're like, oh cool, I got to have a conversation with Iron Man, or something like that.
Like the one in the public domain.
Yeah, or you can do one in the public domain, absolutely. If you wanted to do something like Dracula or the Invisible Man or any of the ones in the public domain, absolutely. That's far easier. The only reason I mention that is because generally people do ones that aren't in the public domain, but that is smarter. That is the smarter way to do it, is public domain. All right. Do you guys have any particular questions? Yes.
What time is it?
It is 4:27.
Time.
Anything else? Other questions? Concerns?
Just like, wait, Bloodborne Chronicles? But like, but like, you're like, but you're part of the
Okay.
too.
So, yes, Eamon?
What is the thing for the next month's story?
For next month's story, I actually haven't decided yet. I usually kind of decide with you guys. I have like a giant pile of ideas. So we can decide that after we get off of this thing. So I will end this then. Thank you all for watching, those of you who watched the YouTube video.